And I think mankind has always had a skewed way of seeing his life and the world around him. And the message today we have is, where are you on the sin meter? And as you might expect, that's a little bit of an odd title, but it's one of those things that as we look at ourselves and we look at other people, it appears we have a two-tier system. While I may make errors, other people mess up completely. While I am not always right, there are other people that are just always wrong. And you know, the truth of it is, we all would like to be just a little better than we are. And we're always really pretty critical of that other guy because we can see everything that's wrong with him. And that kind of attitude prevails in mankind and has prevailed in mankind forever. But it's a delusional thinking, and it's a delusional thinking that Jesus addressed and called hypocrisy. And when he did that, he literally upset everybody that he spoke to. So I guess it shouldn't surprise you and me if he upsets us. Because unfortunately, sometimes the truth hurts. We're going to start reading in Matthew 5, 21 through 30. It says, "You have heard that it was said of the old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable for judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says 'you fool' will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you're offering your gift at the altar and you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come back and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the guard and put you in prison. Truly I will say to you, they will never get out until they have paid that last penny. You have heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than for the whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose a member than for your whole body to go into hell." Now, Jesus is pointing out that our rationalizations don't stand up in God's eyes. I'll be honest with you, that makes me uncomfortable. I cannot tell you how many times I've been angry and not dealt with it. I can't tell you how many times I've considered someone or called someone a fool. Because to be honest with you, there's a lot of foolish people running around today. It's kind of crazy with what some of the things are going on. But the truth of it is, what Jesus is saying here is, I'm not supposed to murder. Oh, I'm okay with that, Lord. I don't murder. I'm also not supposed to call anybody a fool. Well, wait a minute, Lord. What if they are fools? He's like, you don't call them fools. You're judging them. You're making a presumption that you are somehow better than they. And I'll be honest with you, looking at that verse, I have to go, have I ever made it a whole week without doing one of these things? And the truth is, I don't think I have. When I look at the hypocrisy of how I live my life compared to what Jesus says, I have to understand that I am no better than any other person in this world. I am just as much a bad person as that murderer. When I want to rank sin and say, well, you know, sure, I called that guy a fool, but then again, he was acting like a fool, so, you know, I'm just labeling him what he was. Jesus is going, no, you're judging your brother, and you are doing it in a sinful manner. And I will tell you, it doesn't feel comfortable doing that. In fact, from man's perspective, you could call that unfair. I mean, after all, murder and calling someone a fool cannot be ranked in the same category, except that it is, in God's eyes. I can't be charged with adultery just for noticing the girl in a bikini walking by. But according to God, I can. I want to have that two-tier system. And by man's standards, I'm completely justified in doing that two-tier system. But what I want to know, and what I need to know, is that God does not have a two-tier system. I am either innocent or guilty. And what Jesus is pointing out here is we're all guilty. We all are failing in that matter. No, I didn't commit murder today, but I sure did get angry occasionally. I can, in fact, find myself just driving down the road and suddenly find myself with emotions that probably shouldn't have been there. And why? It's just because the person in front of me is doing things I don't want them to do. And who knows, they're sitting there looking at me in the rearview mirror and going, I wish he'd get off my tail. And he's having angry issues. We want an escape hatch to our sin. We want a rationalization that says, yeah, it might be wrong, but it's not as wrong as this other sin. And what Jesus is saying is, no, I've got a bad news for you. You call someone a fool, you might as well have shot him. Because to be honest with you, they're both sin. And I just, as a human being, part of me wants to go, Lord, you should reconsider this. But we're going to move down to Romans 3, verses 9 through 18. And Paul is talking again. It says, what then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are under sin. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside, together they have become worthless, and no one does good, not even one. Now I'm sitting here at Paul, give me a break. But he goes on. Verse 13 says, their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asp is on their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before them, before their eyes. So we're all sinners. And as Paul will tell you in some more of his writings, even my best day is filthy rags. Adrian Rogers, as a radio pastor for many years, he's passed away now, but he had a famous statement. He says, I would not trust the best 15 minutes of my life to get me into heaven. What he was saying is, I am not ever going to be good enough. If I'm really honest with myself, I am going to show that I lack what I need to be in heaven. And I think too often we want to find a way to be justified before God. That if I just do enough good things, if I just do enough right things, if I just do the right things, I'll be okay and God will say that's good enough. But the truth of it is, part of understanding what we need to know to go to salvation is that we cannot do it. We are never going to be good enough. The fact that I am going to fail the rest of my life is a bit depressing, but it's also an essential part of me to recognize that I need God. There's a problem too with what we do when we read scriptures. And there are people who have twisted these scriptures. when they say it's better to pluck out your eye or to cut off your hand, there are people who have, in fact, taken that literally and literally done just that, trying to get rid of their sin. Now, I'm here to tell you that those people have missed God's point completely. If I could eradicate my sin by cutting off my hand or my tongue or my eye, I would somehow be able to get salvation on my own. And that is missing God's point and the whole point of the Bible. There is no such thing as an amputation that will free you from sin. What Jesus is saying with those words is you need to take your sin seriously. While you're not necessarily going to pluck out your eye, you must realize the implication of what that would look like and say, man, I'm not taking this serious enough. You know, the truth of it is, I have grown up with an attitude that, well, you know, it's okay to look. It's, you know, I grew up in what's called the Playboy Generation. Playboy was founded in 1950-something, I don't remember. And I was founded in 1956. So all my life, I have seen magazines, TV shows, and movies that represent sexuality. And society has always said, it's okay. That's just the way you are. You're just a guy. That's just the way it should be. And what Jesus is saying is, you're not taking that serious enough. When he says you look with lust and you've committed adultery, there's a part of me that says, no, not quite, Lord. And Jesus is saying, oh, yes, yes, you have. I want to minimize that. But what Jesus is saying by the metaphor of taking and plucking out your eye or cutting off your hand is saying you are not taking sin seriously, folks, and you need to. You need to understand how much that sin separates you from God. And when you do that, you will have a different attitude about that sin. It's hard because, to be honest with you, man's idea, as I said, is that I'm not as bad as the other guy. And you know, it's amazing to me how often, when I wrote speeding tickets, I would stop a guy and start to write him a ticket. He goes, but you don't understand. Somebody just passed me a mile back and he was going way faster than me. Like that justifies your speeding. The truth of it is, that's mankind's logic. We want a justification that we're not quite as bad as we are. It's hilarious. I had a good friend who is a county supervisor, by the way, and he got stopped for speeding. And he got a speeding ticket. And he goes, you know, I was a little upset with the officer because he treated me like a criminal. And I laughed and I says, well, you were speeding. You were a criminal. And he didn't like that very much. But the reality is, that's the way we are. I'm not as bad a criminal as the guy that robbed the bank. Even though I broke a law, and he's breaking a law, somehow my sin isn't that bad. And what Jesus is trying to explain to you is, yes, it is. You broke the law. Romans 3, verses 21 through 26 says, but now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through the faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is Jesus Christ. And I'm going to stop right there, because what he's saying there is, you're a sinner. Accept it, acknowledge it, and confess it, because you are a sinner. I am a sinner. To try to rationalize that sin will only stop you from accepting that free gift of God, of Jesus Christ. Verse 25 says, whom God put forth in the propitiation by his blood to the received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because his divine forbearance He had passed over the former sins. It is to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be justified and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. You need Jesus. Simply put, I need Jesus. You cannot get salvation by your own works, but you can receive it as a free gift from God. When Jesus Christ went upon that cross, he offered to all who would accept it salvation and the forgiveness of sins. When Jesus Christ told people you should cut off your hand or pluck out your eyes, he was not implying that you somehow can work your way into salvation. You can somehow make yourself better. No, he's not implying that whatsoever. He is using that over-dramatization to point out just how serious our sin is. Because, like I said before, I never make that big of problems. The other people, now they make problems. And I'm real easy to see the sin of the other guy. I just don't want to see it in myself. And I can rationalize and justify, but it's not going to stand up for God. When I take a long, lustful look at a woman, I can justify it and rationalize it. Well, I'm just human. I'm just a guy. It's just normal. What Jesus is saying, and it's still a sin. So it is hard because what I am doing is I'm trying to undo what God is saying. That sin is bad. And that anyone who sins, and by the way, everyone sins, is separating themselves from God. My rationalization that my sin isn't quite as bad as the next guy's may sound real good to me. I might even convince you. But trust me, it doesn't stand up to God. God sees sin in all forms as reprehensible. There is nothing man can do to make himself less sinful. And the problem with that is that man has a tendency to take truth and twist it. And we've been doing that for as long as we have. When Adam and Eve were in the garden, they looked and Satan was trying to tempt him to eat the fruit. It says that Eve looked upon the fruit and it looked delicious. Why? What's wrong with a delicious piece of fruit? Other than God said no. Man has been justifying it by saying, well, it doesn't look that bad. How bad can it be, really? We must accept that we cannot and we should not rationalize our sin. Because unfortunately, it doesn't work. And no matter how much I try to minimize what I do wrong, before God, I'm going to have to confess that yes, those sins were just as heinous as all the others. Romans 6, verse 15 through 19 points out another dilemma that man has. Because there are people who say, well, God loves me, and because he forgave my sin, and it shows that grace is good, maybe I should sin a little bit more. And that way, it'll show people just how much God loves me. And I still hear that around today. This was 2,000 years ago when Paul wrote this, but I still hear that same philosophy. And here's what Paul had to say about that in Romans 6, 15 through 19. What then? Are we to sin because we are no longer under the law but under grace? By no means. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as an obedient slave, you are slaves to that one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or obedience, which leads to righteousness? But thanks be to God that you were once slaves to sin, you have become obedient through the heart of the standard teaching of which you committed, and have been set free from sin, and have become slaves of righteousness. I am speaking in human terms because you are natural limitations. For just as you once presented your members as slaves to impurity and to lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness, leading sanctification. There are people out there that will tell you, God is so much love that I can sin more and more, and all that's going to do is prove just how much God loves me. So sinning is actually a good thing. And like I said, that's a new age thinking. But it's a new age thinking that has 2,000 years of roots, because they were telling Paul that same garbage. And Paul is saying, it doesn't fly. We are going to be slaves to who we serve. I can't tell you how many people today in the United States of America who are living as slaves. And you think about that, and of course I work in human trafficking with Wings of Refuge. And people say, well, of course, those people are slaves because somebody's forcing them. But I would expand that a little bit more. Are you a slave to your checkbook? Are you a slave to your house? Are you a slave to all the indulgences that you have? Are you a slave to food? Are you a slave to any number of things that you allow to control you? I would suggest far too many today are slaves to a TV set or a computer, because that is what controls them most. That is what occupies their time more than anything. You can become a slave to whatever you let run your life. And I'm here to tell you in an uncomfortable way that if you're a slave to anything other than Jesus Christ, that is a distraction from Jesus Christ. I can speak from personal experience. When I was a police officer, I was very centrally focused. I was very successful. And in fact, I got promoted because I was so centrally focused. But I was also a slave to my job. Now, doing a good job is not a bad thing. But that job took precedent over my spiritual walk. And that, my friends, is not only a bad thing, it's an attitude that leads you to falling. We are never going to be free of sin, but we also must be aware that we will choose who we are servants to. And too many of us are becoming accepting of being slaves to something in this world that we can rationalize and justify and discern that maybe it's not as bad as people say. And my attitude about my sin and my sin nature will determine how I deal with sin. When I rank my sin against another person, I'm not going to get right, because I can always find someone who does things worse than me. Trust me, I don't care how bad a person you are. And it's amazing. I was arresting some people in law enforcement one time, and I remember arresting a drunk driver. And he goes, why are you picking on us poor guys having a few beers after work when you should be going after those drug dealers and those drug addicts? Well, ironically, within a week, I arrested a drug dealer. And he's in the office and he's going, why are you picking on me? Why aren't you out there getting some of these drunk drivers off the road that are killing everybody? It's amazing. They both had their rationalization for their sin. Now, I would love to tell you that that's a one-off situation, but it's not. Because if I'm honest, I catch myself in that same dilemma every day when I look at my sin. I cannot compare my sin to others and try and be less sinful than they. I also cannot treat my sin as a minor indiscretion. Because if I look and say, well, I'm just a guy, it's okay to look, it's okay to think, it's okay to do. If I continue with that attitude, I guarantee you I am not going to reject that sin. I must look at my sin through the eyes of God and say, you know what? That's wrong. And not only is it wrong, but it's a wrong that I have been a slave to for too long, and I need to start changing the way I think about my sin and go at it from God's view, not mine. The fact that sin will always be a part of my life causes some of us to say, well, it's inevitable. I just can't help it. God says I'm a sinner. It's this part of it. I'm never going to be good enough, so it just doesn't matter. But accepting that lie is saying that God cannot change me. God desires to place in me a new heart, a new mind. Romans talks about making a transformation of your mind and being renewed in God. The more I confront my sin, I can deal with it in a more biblical manner. I must, though, first see sin for what it was and what it is, and have a desire in my heart to reject that sin. Because if I don't want to reject it, I guarantee you I'm not going to change. You are not a person who is designed to be stagnant in place and just maintain. I say it in my Bible study frequently, but if there's nothing changing in your life, you may want to question whether or not you're a Christian. Becoming a Christian is all about things changing, and not just immediately. I've seen a lot of Christians who, man, when they become Christians, they give up a lot of stuff. And I mean, it's just like, man, total transformation. And their old friends go, what happened to you? Suddenly you're no fun anymore. You don't do all the crazy stuff that we used to do. And we're all like, okay, that's transformation. But I'm here some 40 years or 50 years into my Christian experience, and I'm here to tell you that change is continuing. And it should continue. If you are a Christian, God is going to work on your heart, and He is going to change things in your life, throughout your life. I have been a Christian for some 50 years, and I will tell you that for much of that 50 years, there have been a lot of sins that I felt very comfortable with that I no longer feel comfortable with. I was a very judgmental person. The number of times I could call a person a fool wouldn't be measured in times per week, it'd be times per hour. I was extremely judgmental. I've already admitted I had lots of lustful thoughts. And all those things were just normal. And I was not confronted by them because I wasn't listening to what God said in the Scriptures. I was heavy on the sin meter and light on looking at it to say, yeah, that's wrong. What God wants is the reverse of that. He wants me to constantly be challenging myself and saying, you know what? What is in my life that is taking me away from God and towards sin? The closer I move to God, the more aware of my sin I become, and the more He leads me to address it. Now, I will never be sin-free, but I will tell you that the more closer I get to God, the more I recognize sin, and hopefully the less I practice sin. So the question I have for you today is, where are you on the sin meter? Because denial and delusion will keep you mired in sin and separated from God. But the idea that I can look at myself accurately with Jesus' standards, not mine, and say, yeah, maybe I need to work on a few things, will lead us towards a closer walk with God. And don't be surprised that once He gets past one area, He's got another area lined up. Because after 50 years, I keep finding things that I'm going, well, that was okay 2 years ago. I was good with that 5 years ago. And now I'm suddenly going, I'm not so comfortable with that anymore. That's because God is growing. And hopefully, as Christians, we are constantly growing so that one day when I meet him in heaven, I don't have this abrupt change of personality that says, well, I was always good with that, and now I can't be. Start changing now, because God is taking you on a journey to be more like him. And that journey will take you away from sin. So remember, you are a slave. It's who you are a slave to that you want to be very mindful of. I suggest you become a slave to Jesus Christ. But I will also suggest to you the world today is wanting you to be a slave to sin. So it's a decision you have to find, and it's a sin meter that you have to check for yourself, because it will, in fact, determine your eternal home. Thank you.